Right, we're here with WTO Secretary General, Director General, DG, Director General. Thank goodness it's not live. Uh, WTO Director General Pascal Lamy on a tour of Africa, and obviously very important issues to discuss with him. Now, the question that everyone obviously wants to know is world trade dead? Oh, yeah. So, okay, simplest question to begin with: is world trade dead?
Of course not. World trade is alive, although less vibrant than in the years that preceded this huge economic crisis. The world is still trying to exit. So if you look at world trade numbers for this year, for instance, roughly plus 3% in volumes, which is good growth, but much lower than the 5, 6, 7% we had before the crisis. Now, that's the average number worldwide. There are, of course, big differences depending on the continent you're considering.
Yes.
Europe, very low. US, Japan, a bit higher. And developing countries, including Africa, with good growth, hence higher number of trade.
The problem, though, is DG Lamy, that we're now hearing talk of people starting to negotiate trade outside the WTO system. There's a big EU-US trade talks going on now. There's a EU-ACP ones going on with the developing nations. That sort of tends to imply that people are sidestepping the WTO.
Well, we've had for the last 50 years a coexistence between multilateral trade opening and, let's say, bilateral trade opening. This has been the case for decades. And so far, these two ways of opening trade and integrating economies have worked hand in hand. There hasn't been a contradiction, a tension. Now, so far. Now, remains to be seen whether with these big mega deals, which you're mentioning, EU-US, US-Pacific, China, Korea, Japan, ASEAN plus India, China, Korea, Japan, whether in the future the synergy which has worked in the past will still work. Now, I don't know. It all depends first in what's in there, and second on whether the multiplication of these deals will de facto lead to a multilateral system. After all, if US negotiates with EU and negotiates with Japan and negotiates with Malaysia and negotiates with Australia, it will have to make these various deals coherent. So whether these will converge in the future or not remains to be seen. My own sense as WTO DG, and especially looking at the interest of countries or continents who are not part of these mega deals, such as Africa, or let's say the eastern part of Latin America, I think there needs to be a sort of insurance policy that these mega bilaterals will at the end of the day converge to a meta multilateral.
Problem is, though, Mr. DG, that Africa carrying anything between 1 and 3% of global trade is very small. So people will say there is no need to sign bilateral deals, multilateral deals with Africa. What we want to do is the big trading blocks, like you've just outlined. And so sidestep Africa, and Africa is left to fight for itself.
I think that's true today, but that's not true if you look at the trade potential of Africa. So it may be true today, it won't be true 10 or 20 years from now, because Africa has clearly become a sort of pre-emerging continent. Now, we know that talking about Africa as a single entity is a bit of an approximation, but I think the priority for Africa today, where Africa has a specific problem with trade, is intra-African trade.
Yes.
this continent trades very little with itself. It's changing. If you look at sub-regional trade integration, for instance, this region, East Africa, is way ahead of the curve within Africa in developing trade, regional and economic integration. So that's priority number one. And I think what Africa needs for the rest of the world to upgrade Africa in business or investment intentions is to enlarge the size of its markets. In today's globalized world, if you don't have a market of a minimum of 100 million people, you have no real place around the table. Africa can do that. Again, take the example of this Eastern African community. It's potentially a zone of 150 million people. So that's the way to go for the moment. But I think in the future, Africa has a lot of eggs in the multilateral basket, because in the meantime, they have to rely on multilateral rules and multilateral trade opening.
The problem is, though, and I can see a contradiction. The problem is, though, I can see a certain contradiction in terms, because you have, on the one hand, East Africa, like you said, doing pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, with a global trading system, you might have East Africa being forced to open itself up too soon. So you have preferential trade negotiations with East Africa. So we open ourselves up, and the advantage of being East Africa goes away with that.
I don't think this is a serious threat. There will remain, for the decades to come, a difference in the amount of trade opening depending on your level of development. So Africa is catching up, but starting from a low base. And I think everybody understands that the trade regime of the US is sort of, or EU or Japan is sort of one level. The trade regime of China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, Turkey is another level, and the trade regime of most African countries, who are still much poorer than these sort of big emerging countries, will be different. So I think for the time to come, this is not a real danger. And what really matters today is deepening regional integration, deepening in regional trade within Africa. And this has a lot to do, not so much with custom tariffs anymore, but with issues like border operations, which are still, if you look overall at Africa, a big handicap that increase the cost of trade. If you look what it costs today to move a container from Mombasa or Dar es Salaam to Kigali, in many ways it's a prohibitive cost as compared to other continents. But it also has a lot to do with, for instance, services, which are a large part of our economy. You don't have custom duties on services, but you have regulatory differences in the way you handle banking or insurance or accounting or dredging or architecture. And there is a big mine of efficiencies lying down there, and with harmonization or mutual recognitions of these regulatory standards, the prospects for African trade integration are enormously attracting, provided, of course, you have the sort of political energy to do that. And as we know, the political energy lies at the level of the countries themselves.
Yes. Something you point out. Oh, yeah. I'll do it in my glasses. It makes me look like a professor. Something which you say there that strikes me, which is the different regulations. Some of them come out of a colonial past. So you have French-speaking West Africa, English-speaking Africa, Portuguese-speaking Africa, which points to a certain element of protectionism when it comes to the former colonial rulers. So the French want to protect a certain market within Africa. The British want to protect a certain market within Africa. The Americans obviously trying to get their preferential treatment in these countries. How do you solve against that? With obviously also the new players, China, coming in.
But I think, you're right if you look at the past. there is this colonial legacy, which is there, and certainly Africa has been the continent that has had to cope with, let's say, the heaviest colonial legacy as compared to Latin America or to Asia. But I think it's not something of the future. Now, Africa is standing on its own feet. Africa's population is growing. Africa's growth is more than half generated today by domestic consumption. Africa now is not begging the rest of the world for market access. It's the rest of the world that will be begging for market access in Africa in a few years. And the first comers, the one that will understand this the first, will be the big winners of this game. So I really see Africa now as a much more attractive place. And I think, the time where these trade issues were considered as a defensive are over. Africa is now on the offensive, again, starting with its own capacity to deepen its own regional markets.
Finally, there's the leadership of global institutions, and you know where I'm going with this. You're leaving the WTO, and one of the candidates a few months ago to replace you is now our Foreign Secretary, Amina Mohammed. Without going too deeply into how your succession played out, are African countries doing the best they can to ensure that Africans are at the top, or at least near the top, of these global organizations?
I think the sort of balance of nationalities in the heads of these various organizations is inevitably a reflection of the new geopolitical balance. Now, once you're in this position, forget your nationality.
Yes.
There's no way the World Bank president, who's an American, or the IMF managing director, who's a European, or the next WTO DG, who will be a Brazilian, can have their flag in their mind. The moment they start doing this, they are dead. But it's true that the selection/election process, which took place in WTO, is a variation of this. There were 9 candidates, very good people, including your new cabinet secretary for foreign affairs in Kenya. Finally, a Brazilian won that race. I think it's been open, it's been fair, it's been understandable, and I happen to believe that the way the WTO DG is selected compared to other international organizations is a fairly modern and transparent way. It's for sure more transparent and in a way more democratic than the World Bank or the IMF, which after all is something which WTO should be credited with. Now, there were very good Africans in other international institutions in the past. Kande Yunkela, who's leaving UNIDO, was an excellent DG. Jacques Diouf, who was at the head of the Food and Agricultural Organization for a long time, was a very good technician. So it comes and goes. A Kenyan will become the new Secretary General of UNCTAD, which is the United Nations Conference for Trade and Development, which is more focused on developing countries. So, it comes and goes. I think at the end of the day, what matters is to be able to project in the international scene people who have a political and a technical experience. And I have no doubt that in the future, this will keep diversifying.
Thank you very much, Steve.
My pleasure.
All right.
My pleasure.
Great.
Good?
Good. Yes.
That would be very strange in France.
Because I thought your microphone on. This goes